Well, on November of 1963, I was 8.5 years old. I remember staying up late on the Thursday night, the 21st, and looking with my brother's telescope down. We lived off of Indian Creek Drive, and we could see cars well. And I remember with my brother's telescope, we could see the presidential seal. And my dad said, "Get in the car. Come on, we're going to go see the motorcade go by." And I said, "Well, we're not dressed." It was about after 11 o'clock. And he said, "That's okay. Just grab a robe and jump in the car." We jumped in my dad's Oldsmobile, and we drove down to where Westover Road comes out of Roaring Springs Road. And we sat there and we saw the whole motorcade go by. Well, the next morning, my brother Bob, who's the reason I was even there, he was 11, he woke my dad up and said, "You promised to take us to see the President Kennedy." And he said, my dad looked out the window, saw it was kind of a drizzly morning, and thought, God, he's going to have these two boys in a crowd. He liked Kennedy, but he thought it might be a bit of a hassle. And my brother used the two words you never want to, you promised. So he said, "Get your brother dressed," and we drove down. It was about a 10-minute drive down, and we parked, I'd say about 6 blocks away, and we walked in, and we became part of a crowd of about 4,000 to 5,000 people. We were probably standing around the crowd for about 20 minutes when here comes President Kennedy with Johnson and Connally and Jim Wright and Senator Yarborough, and they got up on what was I didn't know it at the time, it was a flatbed truck they'd put bunting on, and the presidential seal there and the lectern. And it was amazing to see President Kennedy because, God, I had mostly seen him on television in black and white, and there he was in living color, and I couldn't believe how red his hair was. A Navy suit on, and he seemed in very good spirits. He made a joke about his wife, Jackie, not being there, but of course she took a little longer to get ready in the morning, but she looked a lot better. And it was I remember just a real euphoric crowd. I was a bit young to really understand later the consequences of the event. I couldn't believe he had been killed. I came in off the recess playground. I was going to St. Alice, Catholic school off of Camp Bowie. And I remember the nuns were all crying, and they told us to put our heads down on the desks, and the news came through on the radio that he had died. And you see, after that happened, everyone in the North Texas area wanted to pretend like it had never happened. It was such a dark stain on these local communities, and nobody would talk about it. If you happened to go by Dealey Plaza and saw people walking around gawking, you could bet your last nickel they were not from North Texas. And I think this event tonight, in a way, is kind of long overdue. Not just to remember, but we forget what a great trip they had up until it all went wrong. Yeah, they were, Jackie, this was the first trip the First Lady had taken with him since they had lost their baby in the summer, and they were really, they'd had a great day before in San Antonio and Houston, and the crowds in Fort Worth, and even the crowds in Dallas for that matter. They were really kind of amazed, all the people that had come out to wish them well. So I think there's still a healing going on. I think it's been such a point of humiliation for the area. That I think it's long overdue, and I think it's to be remembered that the trip was a great trip until they got to Dealey Plaza.
And can you tell us something about Parkland?
Oh, Parkland is a movie that started out as a mini-series, an 8-hour mini-series that I was in Dallas at the film festival about 6 years ago. I had never been to the 6th floor museum. At that time, it was about 20 years old. And I decided to go over there. I was staying at the W Hotel, which is that west side of Dallas. It's kind of built up now. And I had always wanted to go over there. I'd been by Dealey Plaza many times as a boy growing up. And I put on a baseball cap and I went over there and I went through it. And the first thing I saw was a still from the speech in Fort Worth in the parking lot of the Hotel Texas. And the next day I called the curator, Gary Mack, and I got him on the phone. He knew who I was. I said, I was in that crowd. I said, do you have any pictures from the front? And he didn't, he was kind of cajoling me a bit. And then later that afternoon they called me and said, we found some images, and it was from a newsreel, 16 millimeter newsreel. I forget the man who shot it, a guy named Cooper, I believe. And you can see me in a couple of moments there, cuts from the president to the crowd. And it kind of gave me an idea. I thought, has anybody ever told this from a human interest story? It seemed like it was always, any kind of dramatization of the event was always kind of, done in it with a conspiracy angle, like Oliver Stone's movie and a lot of others. I remember the first one I think was called Executive Action or something like that. And I thought, has anybody ever told this story just from a human interest point of view? These people woke up that day. Nobody knew the world was about to change. This catastrophe was about to happen. And if you just follow, there's so much that's known about what happened. We thought it would be a great idea, so I found out that Vincent Bugliosi had a book, and Stephen Fagan at the Sixth Floor Museum told me that they had an advance copy of part of the book, which he lent me to read. The book was coming out in about 4 months. I guess this was 2007. And I read this thing, and I called up Tom Hanks's office. I said, I got to see Tom. I knew Tom from Apollo 13, and his company produced Big Love. And we've been friends since we did Apollo, and he was, I got a call from his assistant, said he's going to be at the ball game tonight at Dodger Stadium and wants you to come down and join him, tell him what this thing's all about. So I went down there and I sat in his box with him, and I told him, I said, your company has made kind of a reputation doing many long-form dramas of American history. I said, I think I have your next miniseries. It's telling the story of the assassination in Dallas and to correspond it with the 50th anniversary that's coming up. And so he called up HBO and said, I've got my next miniseries for you. And so we got the book, the Bugliosi book. We got the rights to that, and we had a meeting with Bugliosi. Interesting, very interesting man. I mean, that book's his references have references in that book. It's a cellular analysis of the event. And we hired Peter Landesman, who would ultimately direct the movie as well, to write it as an 8-hour miniseries. When HBO decided not to go forward with it, after several years of putting it together, we were all greatly disappointed. But Playtone was not able to be involved at that point, and that's when I I was not involved in the production of Parkland. So I came up with the idea and the inception of it, and I developed it as a miniseries, but I'm not involved with it as a movie. I'm a producer on it, but it's because I got it all going. But I wish it well. They've tried to compress a lot of story, but I think the stories that come across in it is Paul Giamatti as Abraham Zapruder. That's quite a poignant story. And Forrest Sorrells, who was the Dallas head of the Secret Service, played by Billy Bob Thornton. Marcy Gay Harden plays Nurse Nelson, who's the head nurse of the ER. Ron Livingston plays James Hosty. The poor guy was tracking Oswald, but he didn't have the file. It actually arrived from New Orleans that morning. And I tell you, the most poignant performance in the movie is given by an actor named James Badge Dale, who plays Robert Oswald, who had a jailhouse conversation with his brother, and 2 days later he was trying to find somebody to say some words over his body. No ministers would come and say words, so he finally found a retired minister to come out. And Hugh Ainsworth, who's here tonight, I got to know Hugh when we were researching the miniseries, and he told me he was one of the pallbearers. They didn't even have pallbearers, so they asked the newsman, would you help us, bury him here? But I always thought Robert Oswald's story was a poignant one. And he was a stand-up guy. He'd been a Marine. I think he was working for Acme Brick at the time in Denton, and I believe he's still alive. I've never been able to meet him, or had the pleasure.
So you were 8, your brother was 11, and what your dad's name?
My dad's name was John Paxton, and I grew up in Fort Worth because there was a family lumber business here. It started in Kansas City. It was called the Frank Paxton Lumber Company. They were wholesalers of hardwoods, and they were off of Bryan Avenue, not far from here, off of Berry. And it was set up here. It was out of Kansas City and a few other cities, but it started in Fort Worth in 1935 because my grandfather was sitting in his study in Kansas City right night reading the Saturday Evening Post, and he'd been considering putting a yard in Dallas, but he read a profile about a flamboyant Fort Worth man named Amon Carter. He decided he'd put the lumber yard in Fort Worth, and that's why I'm even here right now. It's so funny how you kind of go, God, it's so capricious how we all end up in this world.